let's take a minute right now and turn to John chapter 19. John chapter 21, and reading from verse 9 to 19. And this is the passage where this question of the day comes from today. So let's take a look at that. It says, when they got out on land, they saw a charcoal fire in place with fish laid out on it and bread. Jesus said to them, that's his disciples, bring some of the fish that you have just caught. So Simon Peter went aboard and hauled the net ashore full of large fish, 153 of them. And although there were so many, the net was not torn. Jesus said to them, come and have breakfast. Now none of the disciples dared ask him, who are you? They knew it was the Lord. Jesus came and took the bread and gave it to them, and so with the fish. This was now the third time that Jesus was revealed to the disciples after he was raised from the dead. When they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? He said to him, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. He said to him, feed my lambs. He said to him a second time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? He said to him, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. He said to him, tend my sheep. He said to him the third time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter was grieved because he said to him the third time, do you love me? And he said to him, Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you. Jesus said to him, feed my sheep. Truly, truly, I say to you, when you were young, you used to dress yourself and walk wherever you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and another will dress you and carry you where you do not want to go. This he said to show by what kind of death he was to glorify God. And after saying this, he said to him, follow me.
Well, welcome to week 6 of our series, 7 Questions Jesus Asked. Today, our question, as you heard, is, do you love me? And we were joking before the service because I'm going to repeat that question a lot. And just to be clear, this is the words of Jesus, not mine. I'm not that insecure. Hey, guys. I didn't put Bartley up to that intro. But it did make me think of something, though. When my wife and I first met and started dating, we were like not quite high school sweethearts. It was kind of like end of high school, beginning of college when we met. And things were starting to get serious, and we were out during the summer hanging out with a bunch of my friends and some of their girlfriends. And, you know, Jen and I were kind of off on our own. And so my friends, you know, they start chirping at me, trying to embarrass me from a distance, as all good friends do. And you know, they were on my case because obviously Jen was getting most of my attention that they used to get. And this goes on for a while until finally one of my friends yells out, do you love her? Well, things suddenly got very real. Jen's looking at me. I'm looking at Jen. What do I say? I can't pretend I didn't hear it. I can't just laugh it off. I can't, you know, what am I going to do? She's looking at me. She's obviously very curious what I'm about to say. And so in that split second, I've been thrown into this position where I have to take stock of the entirety of our relationship and where it may be going. And whatever comes out of my mouth next, there's no turning back from. Now, imagine you're Peter. You're scraping by as a blue-collar fisherman when a rabbi comes and invites you to become his apprentice. This is like the equivalent of somebody just coming up to you and giving you a free scholarship to Harvard. You accept, and you witness this rabbi work miracles, heal people. You come to learn he's the Son of God, God himself even. But then he's arrested, put on trial for his life. And when you're asked if you know him during this trial, you outright deny it, not once, but 3 times. He's eventually put to death, but then comes back from the dead, at which point you meet and talk with him on multiple occasions. And then on one of these occasions, he takes you aside and says, do you love me? In every relationship, including a relationship with Jesus, and I would say especially in a relationship with Jesus, we reach a point where we have to decide if this relationship is going to be everything we hoped it would be and everything we intended it to be. And even when we know everything that we hope and all of the intentions we have for that relationship, this can still be a very difficult, weighty question to answer. When I was dating Jen, I had every hope and intention that maybe she could be the one. But when asked if I love her, well, hold on a minute. I'm going to need a second to think about that, right? How am I going to answer this? We pursue faith with the hope and intention of following Jesus into eternity. But if asked, do you love him? How do you answer? Honestly, how do you answer that? I believe in Jesus and I follow Jesus, to varying levels of success. But do I really love Jesus? Do I and can I love someone I've never physically met, I've never spoken to face? For me, that's something that I've always felt like was a bit of a challenge, a sticky point in my faith journey. And it's something that I hope this story that we read a little piece of in John 21 could shed some light on today. So to start, I want to kind of step back and frame the scene in which this happens and look at a few details that kind of surround the setting in which Jesus asked this question. So the very first thing we see that precedes what Pastor Bartley read for us this morning was that the disciples, after Jesus died and was resurrected, they went back to fishing. John starts the chapter like this. He says, after Jesus revealed himself again to the disciples by the Sea of Tiberias, and he revealed himself in this way. Simon Peter, Thomas called the twin, Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and 2 others of his disciples were together. Simon Peter said to them, I am going fishing. They said to him, we will go with you. They went out, got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. So we're not told why they went back to fishing. It's interesting. They had seen the resurrected Jesus at this point, but they were still, something was going on. Were they still discouraged in some way? Were they afraid of all the scrutiny they were receiving in the wake of his crucifixion? Were they just being practical? They figured their discipleship under this rabbi was over, so they had to go back to making a living the old way? We don't know, but it's interesting. So next, this little episode happens between Jesus out on the beach and them in the boat, and we'll get to more on that later. But eventually they come to shore where Jesus has prepared a breakfast, and he poses this question there to Peter, do you love me? But not just that, he says, do you love me more than these? What did Jesus mean by more than these? It's not entirely clear. He could have meant, do you love me more than the boats, the fish, all this stuff of life that you've returned to? He could have meant, do you love me more than these men? More than you love these other disciples? Or did he mean, do you love me more than these men love me? Probably the last option is a likely possibility, since Peter had once boasted, though they all fall away because of you, I will never fall away. So maybe Jesus is picking at that a little bit. Whatever the case may be, I think the bottom line we can get out of this is that to love Jesus is to love him more than. To love Jesus is to love him more than your favorite pastimes, more than your career, more than your friends, more than your family, more than yourself even. Jesus once challenged us in this. He said, whoever loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. And whoever loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. To love Jesus is to love him more than. And in regards to Peter, it seems that Jesus was probably recalling that earlier boasting he had done, and he's asking him to put his money where his mouth is, and love him beyond comparison. To love Jesus is to excel at loving him. It's not to be this average sort of love. The call to love Jesus is probably the highest, not probably, it is the highest calling to love we'll ever be faced with. And so that's a big question. Do you love me? So continuing on the text, we see that Jesus asks Peter a second time if he loves him. And then following that, it says that Peter was grieved because he said to him the third time, do you love me? Peter was grieved. Why was he grieved? Was it because Jesus had asked him those 3 times and Peter answered 3 times, yes, Lord? Well, actually, at that point, it had only been twice, but was he offended that Jesus didn't seem to believe him and he repeated in asking him? Or was it because Peter was reminded of those times that he had actually denied him leading up to his crucifixion? Was that coming to mind as Jesus is asking him this question repeatedly, and he's remembering the question he had to answer before repeatedly, do you know this man? And he said, no, I don't know him. Maybe he was starting to feel like a fraud. So let me put the question to you then. How would you feel if you were confronted with the question of your love for Jesus? Would you feel unsure in it? Would you feel like it's a real love? Would you doubt that love? Do you ever feel like, well, I say I love him, but my life doesn't exactly radiate with love for Jesus? If you feel that way, it's okay. You're not alone. In response to Jesus' question, do you love me? I want to wrestle with my own question and our own question of how can we love Jesus? And I thought we could obviously explore that this morning through this exchange between Jesus and Peter that we read in John chapter 21. As we read earlier, this exchange of dialogue, it has a repetition. It repeats 3 times. And each time there's like this 3-part pattern. It starts with Jesus' question. He says, do you love me, right? The first 2 times that Jesus asks this, John, who wrote this gospel, uses the Greek word agape for love when Jesus asks that word or asks that question. Then we get Peter replies, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. But here, John chooses the Greek word phileo for love in Peter's reply. And then the third part of this little pattern is that Jesus responds, feed my lambs or feed my sheep, tend my sheep, feed my sheep. So we see this happen 3 times. And I want to dig into this a little bit. So let's start with Jesus' question and this word agape. You may already be familiar with this. We've talked about it before in some of our past sermons. You may have read about it. There are different words in the Greek language for love, and we see them used all throughout the New Testament, which was originally written in Greek. The first 2 times Jesus asks Peter, do you love me? John uses that word agape. And so if you're not aware, agape is this selfless, unconditional love. It's usually associated with the divine love of God because it's like this highest form of love. It seeks the best for others. It's sacrificial. It expects nothing in return. So in choosing that word, John seems to suggest that Jesus' question sets the bar very high for his expectations of Peter's love for him. The thing I find most interesting in this context about the word agape is that it's not based on feelings so much as it is a choice. It's a commitment and it's a deliberate action to love, to agape. In the years since that moment where I had to decide how I was going to respond to my friend's question, do you love her? I've discovered more and more that my love for my wife probably isn't as much of, a falling in love, so to speak, as it is, as I would have expected. Like quite possibly it's more often a choosing to love than a falling in love. The famous German pastor Dietrich Bonhoeffer wrote a letter once to his niece on her wedding day while he was imprisoned by the Gestapo. And here's what he said to her. He said, today you are young and very much in love, and you think that your love can sustain your marriage. It can't. Let your marriage sustain your love. So I know all of this may sound like I'm de-romanticizing the idea of love, but if you think about it, this is actually pretty cool. If love is a choice and you choose to love someone and you strive to love them, isn't that more meaningful than a feeling that just happens to you, that comes and goes completely out of your control? So in light of this sort of view of love, how can we love Jesus? I think many of us are waiting for that feeling. We're waiting for the feeling of love to arrive and overcome us. We're waiting to, quote unquote, fall in love with Jesus, when in fact, love is often a choice and a discipline. A discipline. Let me explain that. Love is a choice. Some of you have yet to make that choice to love Jesus for the very first time. You're faced with this decision whether a relationship with Jesus is going to be everything you hope it could be and everything you intend it could be. And so your next step is to make that decision. That might come in the form of being baptized. It's the idea that you choose to follow him. You choose to trust him. You aim your life in his direction and you commit yourself to him. It's a commitment. Others of us are more like Peter. We've made that initial choice or commitment, but now we need to reaffirm it. We need to support it. Our love is often tested, and it may not prove as strong as we think it is all the time, as he discovered when he denied Jesus. So we need to reinforce it. And none of this is to say that we never feel love for Jesus. We do, and we'll get to that in a bit. But I don't think the feeling of love is going to sustain our relationship with Jesus without having that decision and that commitment to love him. So once we've made that choice, then it becomes a discipline. Author David Brooks, he defines commitment this way. He says a commitment is falling in love with something or someone and then building a structure of behavior around it for those moments when love falters. Many of us have probably experienced and learned that love can be work. It's maintained through effort, through intentionality, and even planning and scheduling. You know, you have to coordinate schedules and make plans to stay connected with your friends so that you don't drift apart. You have to build traditions and create rhythms of togetherness with your families, your parents, your siblings. You have to share responsibilities with your spouse and make that effort to make time for date nights, right? There's a structure to this. And the same is true with Jesus. If you choose to love Jesus, and hopefully you grow in that love and you feel that love as well, but you still need a discipline and a structure of behavior for when those feelings of love falter. So I want to ask you, do you have a structure of behavior to support your love for Jesus? I've been working at this myself. I'll be honest, it's a struggle, but I've read a couple of books now that mention this idea of a rule of life, and it's a very interesting concept that I've been trying to put into place. It's an old Christian concept, but basically it's a set structure. It's a schedule of practices and rhythms to create space in life to be with Jesus. So what I've done is I've put mine into writing in a note on my phone so that I can go back and read it as a reminder, so that I can change it and update it as I need. But basically it consists of things like regular times of scripture reading and prayer every day. Ongoing study, usually for me it's the form of having a good Christian book on spiritual development on the go at all times. It's working in times of silence and solitude, just being open to God, being alone with God, no podcasts, no earbuds, no music. It's rhythms of rest and play worked into our busy, hurried schedules. For me, it's also a written commitment to being in community, to making that effort to be there, and to embrace simplicity and just be appreciative and content with what I have. So having said all of that, I realize the idea of love as a discipline may sound a little mechanical. Maybe it's a little too rote or regimented for your tastes, but just stay with me, because next I want to talk about the idea of this phileo, Greek word phileo for love. Because when Peter responds, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you," then John writes the Greek word phileo. Phileo is more of an affectionate, relational love. It's often referred to as a brotherly love. It's more emotional than agape, and it's rooted in mutual connection and companionship. So rather than being this sort of choice or commitment, it's something that's more of a reciprocal type of relationship. So when Jesus asks, "Do you love me?" agape, and Peter responds, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you," phileo, what's going on? Like, why did John do that? Some scholars think these words are simply interchangeable, and so it's just a stylistic thing. There's really no deep meaning behind it. For myself, I'm compelled to think John must have been up to something here. Why would he make that deliberate choice? And I think maybe what he's trying to say is that Peter was experiencing love for Jesus. It was phileo, it was relational, it was affectionate. But Jesus is calling him to agape, a committed, selfless, sacrificial love. And that doesn't diminish the importance of phileo. God created us to be relational beings, and we crave emotional, reciprocal types of love. That's how he made us. There's a Christian psychiatrist named Kurt Thompson, and he says, we're all born into the world looking for someone looking for us. Right? There's other concepts in psychology, things like emotional resonance, this idea that we look for reciprocal love. But in other words, our deepest longing is to feel loved, and our ability to love is often fanned into flame when we ourselves feel loved. And God, again, knows this about us. We are his creation. John, in one of his other writings in the New Testament, says, we love because he first loved us. So he acknowledges it right there. Paul said something similar. He said, God shows his love for us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. So knowing all this, it seems like Jesus has orchestrated this entire scene in chapter 21 of the book of John to remind the disciples of his love for them. Let me show you what I mean. This is really cool. We're going to go a little more through the story here. So Jesus is on the shore. And the disciples are out fishing. We just saw that they went back to fishing. And they don't recognize him at first. And Jesus, he calls out to them, he says, "Children, do you have any fish?" They answered him, "No." He said to them, "Cast the net on the right side of the boat and you will find some." So they cast it, and now they were able to haul it in because of the they were not, able to haul it in because of the quantity of the fish. So if you know the Gospels, you'll know that this event mirrors the miraculous catch of fish that took place when Jesus first chose them to be his disciples. This goes back to the time that Jesus handpicked this bunch of fishermen to apprentice him. Of all the people he could have chosen, he picked a bunch of humble fishermen to this divine calling, and right now he makes them think back to that. Next, coming back to John 21, after they recognize him with this huge catch of fish, Jesus tells them, "Bring some of the fish that you have just caught to add to this breakfast he's already preparing." So he invites them to contribute something to what he's doing, much like he did when a small boy brought a fish and some bread that he multiplied to feed 5,000 people. So after that, they eat breakfast together. And John writes, "Jesus came and took the bread and gave it to them, and so with the fish." This sounds a little familiar too. It echoes the Last Supper, where Jesus broke bread with his disciples and ate with them before he was crucified. And then, of course, we've already touched on this a little bit, but after the Last Supper, Jesus is arrested, and 3 separate times Peter is asked if he knows Jesus, and 3 times he denies him. And so after this breakfast, Jesus asks Peter 3 times if he loves him, once for every denial, as if he's giving Peter the chance to right each of the wrongs that he is so ashamed of. And then lastly, I think this is pretty cool, and this is what makes me think John was up to something when he wrote this. Again, those first 2 times that Jesus asks Peter if he loves him, agape, and Peter replies, "Yes, Lord, you know I love you," phileo. But then the 3rd time Jesus asks, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" John uses the word phileo this time in Jesus' speech. So I'm thinking, if John chose these words on purpose, what could he be doing here? And I think he's trying to show the grace of Jesus, that he's now coming and meeting Peter exactly where he's at in his love for Jesus. In other words, Jesus accepts Peter's love, wherever it's at, as sufficient. But then he goes on to tell Peter that he will grow into this agape, self-sacrificial love. Because next he says, "Truly, truly, I say to you, when you were young, you used to dress yourself and walk wherever you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and another will dress you and carry you where you do not want to go." This he said to show by what kind of death he was to glorify God. So he's telling him that, Peter, you are going to give your life for me, and that's agape. He gives Peter this glimpse into the future to show him that his phileo, relational, emotional love, is going to grow into this self-sacrificing agape. So I got to come back to our question for ourselves. How can we love Jesus? Well, in the context of this phileo aspect of love, it's by knowing his love for us. When we can understand and appreciate the depth of that love, I think we're compelled to reciprocate. When as we read that little quote from Kurt Thompson, when we know he's looking for us, when he's loving us, we love in return. And the only way we can do this is to be reminded of that love regularly, which obviously we forget a lot. It gets crowded out so easily, so we need to revisit it constantly. We need to read the Gospels. We need to read the letters of the early church in the New Testament that record this loving ministry, these amazing things he did in his life, Jesus' death and his resurrection. We need to sing songs like we have this morning that are filled with reminders of Jesus' love for us, that remind us that we have been saved, that we have hope, that God is a God of love. And we need to take time to reflect on the sacrifice that he made for us. We got to make time in our schedules for that, to not let it get crowded out, to remember how for each one of us, for each of our individual sins, past, present, and future, Jesus died for all of that. Paul wrote about this. He says, "The life I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me." So part of the discipline of love that we talked about earlier, or if you want to get specific and create a rule of life like we talked about, part of that is to help us more clearly see and understand and remember the love Jesus has for us, right? So to bring all this together is to say that agape and phileo, these are two forms of love that we have to hold in balance. And me kind of hypothesizing here what John may have been up to in using these words is just that I think we have to have both and we have to use both. Loving Jesus is a choice and a commitment that's going to require discipline on our part, but it's also an emotional response and a reciprocation of love that we experience from him. And so we need to bring those together. Now, there's one last thing that I want to look at before we finish. As I said, there's kind of three parts to these exchanges between Jesus and Peter. Jesus asks, "Do you love me?" Peter responds, "Yes, you know I love you." But then Jesus doesn't just pose the question. He follows it up with what I would call a call to action. I work in marketing and communications as well, and so a call to action is just this crucial element of communication that you got to have because it tells your audience exactly what you want them to do. So Jesus uses a question, "Do you love me?" to spur Peter on with some really difficult self-reflection. Do you love me? He gets Peter thinking. And many advertising campaigns will do that. They'll use a question to get the audience to think, to self-assess, to develop a desire for their product or service. You've seen things like this. Here's a few examples. You've got Gatorade, "Is it in you?" Capital One, "What's in your wallet?" Samsung Galaxy asked if you're ready for the next big thing. Snickers says, "Hungry? Why wait?" Right? They ask a question. But think about it, that question doesn't do much if there's no action then applied to any of those things. There's a desire developed, but there's no action applied. You need that call to action. Buy now. Get yours. Apply today. Subscribe, whatever it is. The question invokes action. And Jesus did this. He said, "Do you love me?" And then he followed up with, "Feed my lambs. Tend my sheep. Feed my sheep." So, of course, Jesus often used a picture of a shepherd for himself and sheep for his followers. And so now he's about to leave. He's about to ascend to heaven, and he's passing the work of caring for the sheep, his followers, and the soon-to-be church over to Peter. So this is the outworking of love that Jesus was asking for from Peter in this moment. So for us, how do we do that today in our context? What is our call to action? I think the takeaway for us is that we can express love to Jesus by loving each other. We in the church, we tend to talk a lot about outreach and evangelism, which is, of course, is very important. Jesus left us with a great commission. He said, we are to continue his work, to go out sharing the gospel, baptizing, sharing his light, introducing him to people who don't know him. But sometimes we ignore the fact that we're also supposed to love his family. The New Testament provides plenty of instruction on this, and so I'm going to share a few with you. John himself, earlier in his gospel, records Jesus saying, "A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another. Just as I have loved you, you are also to love one another. By this, all people will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another." A lot of Paul's letters speak about this. In Galatians, he says, "So then, as we have opportunity, let us do good to everyone, and especially to those who are of the household of faith." So he prioritizes the church. He also said in Ephesians, "We are to grow up in every way into him who is the head, into Christ, from whom the whole body, joined and held together by every joint with which it is equipped, when each part is working properly, makes the body grow so that it builds itself up in love." So he's talking about the body as an image of the church and how everybody has a different role and gifting, but the goal is to build each other up in love. The writer of Hebrews says, "And let us consider how to stir up one another to love and good works, not neglecting to meet together as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day drawing near." Right? Don't neglect meeting together, as some do. Encourage one another, be together. And then one last one from 1 Corinthians, Paul says, "So with yourselves, since you are eager for manifestations of the Spirit, strive to excel in building up the church." The Corinthians, they were interested in the spiritual gifts of the Holy Spirit. And he says, okay, but use them to strive to excel in building up the church. So how do we do this here at Renew Church? And I think I want to keep this super simple. I think there's just one simple answer that's the easy starting point for everything, and that is just to show up. Show up. As a staff member of the church, I feel like sometimes it can feel a little self-serving to come up here, give a Sunday message, and promote church events and ministries. It's kind of like, when you listen to a podcast or interview and the person just wants to plug their latest book. Like, I'll admit, I'm a little biased. We put work into these things, and so of course we want to see good attendance come out. But it's so much more than that. It's that your presence matters. Pastor Bartley mentioned this recently. Your presence matters. Even if you're not volunteering or serving in some real specific way, just you being there is incredibly important. It might be just a few words you say, a few moments you spend listening to a brother or sister. That can be your way of feeding and tending the sheep. We saw this in an amazing way at the recent men's events, just guys getting together. So I want to encourage you to show up. And don't just come for what you think you can get out of it, but what you can offer, even if you don't think you have much to offer. And don't only come to the things that interest you, but take an active interest in where others are. I think we're blessed, and this is something that we've been able to do well, is we have so many opportunities here to care for each other. We have Renew groups. We have Ignite Youth. We have our Sunday morning ministries. We have retreats. We have men's events and meals. We have women's events and meals. We have classes. We have Compass mentorship. We have the upcoming 24-hour prayer night, and the list goes on. Now, having said all that, we understand that you can't be at everything. We don't want to overschedule ourselves, but be there when you can and push yourself not to just show up because you think you'll benefit or just when you feel like it or when you've got nothing better to do. Give this some priority. Give your church family some priority. If you like that idea of the rule of life, write it in there. Come and contribute your presence and offer something, even if it's as simple as a listening ear, listening to what people have to say. And in doing so, you show your love and care, not just for your church family, but for Jesus. Here's something really interesting about this exchange that's been happening that we've been reading about between Jesus and Peter. The third time that Jesus asked Peter if he loved him, Peter replied, "Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you." So essentially saying, Lord, you can see all the way into my heart. Like, how can you question that? You know that I love you. You just know. But even having that knowledge, Jesus still asked him to do this. He still asked him to feed his sheep. He still asked him to tend his sheep. And so we can say, of course I love Jesus, and he knows that I do, but that doesn't exempt us from doing what he asked us to do. It doesn't exempt us from being part of this family. So I wouldn't be a very good marketer if I didn't leave you with some final calls to action. So that's what I'm going to do. As the band comes up, I'm just going to sort of recap and give you some action items. So let's ask again, do you love Jesus? And if so, here's what I propose that we do. First, we need to choose to love Jesus. It's an active choice. And so if you've never done that, then you know your first step. We have a baptism service coming up in January. But you know what? If you're not there yet, there's a smaller step you can take. Just reach out to someone, our pastors, our elders, our Renew group leaders. Anybody would be happy to chat. If you know you've already made that choice, then just ask yourself, am I keeping up with that commitment? Has it been a commitment for me to love Jesus? Could I be more disciplined in that? And if the answer is yes, then why not take some time to formalize those rhythms of life and those structures of behavior? Maybe write it down. Maybe talk to someone who could hold you accountable to it or who could do it together with you. Second, we need to connect ourselves to the love of Jesus. And to do that, I think it's quite simple. We just need to set aside some time, a few hours a day, maybe a weekend, some time to just really focus on what Jesus did for you and his love for you. Maybe you could take a brief pause once a day in the week ahead. Or maybe you need to actually take a real proper Sabbath. Maybe you need to go even bigger and allow yourself a little spiritual retreat. Or maybe you use our 24-hour prayer weekend next weekend for that. Get engaged with what's going on there. And then thirdly, we need to make time for our church community. So if you're not already connected somewhere, that would be a good start. Join a Renew group. There's a connection point coming up. You could learn what that entails. If you've already been plugged in for a while, then maybe it's time to dip a toe into something new, right? Maybe something you've never attended before, or hang out with some people you've never spent much time with. Come to our men's breakfast, or go to the women's international potluck, or go to a retreat you've never been to. Or maybe you just need to invite somebody here for lunch or a coffee. So, a few ideas, but as we wrap up today, I want to give you a head start on number 2 here. The band is going to lead us in a song called God Really Loves Us. It's a great song. And I want to invite you to stand, and as you do it, just really focus on the words. Think about what they mean to you as they sing, and let's sing that together. Before we do, I'll quickly pray, and then we can stand together. God, we thank you so much for your deep, deep love for us, that your love is unconditional. It is the highest form of love. It was big enough to sacrifice your son, Jesus, for us. You loved us first. While we were still in sin, you loved us. And so, God, we pray that would stir our hearts towards love to you, and that in that stirring, we would make the choice, the commitment to love you, that we would be disciplined in our love, and that we would just feel that reciprocation of love between us and you. We thank you for this church family. We thank you for all of the people here who you called to love you and help us to love each other and show the world that we are your disciples with our love for you. God, be with us when our love falters, and help us to find structures and rhythms and things that can help us return to you when we're beaten up by the world, when we're tempted, and help us to encourage each other and build each other up. And so, God, we lift up this song to you in praise and ask that you would be with us in the week ahead. In Jesus' name, amen.
Join us every Sunday at 10 a.m. at Cineplex Cinemas in Milton, or visit us online at renewchurch.ca/connect.